Mr. McSorley, you have up to 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the committee for this invitation to speak to Bill C-63. I'm grateful to be here on behalf of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, a coalition of 44 Canadian civil society organizations which works to defend civil liberties in the context of national security and anti-terrorism measures. The provisions of this bill, particularly in regards to Part 1, the Online Harms Act, are vastly improved over the government's original 2021 proposal, and we believe it will respond to urgent and important issues. However, there are still areas of serious concern that must be addressed, especially regarding undue restrictions on free expression and infringement on privacy. This includes, in Part 1 of the Act, first, the overly broad definition of the harm of content that incites violent extremism or terrorism will lead to over-moderation and censorship. Further, given the inclusion of the online harm of content that incites violence, it is redundant and unnecessary. Second, the definition of content that incites violence itself is overly broad and will lead to content advocating for protest to be made inaccessible on social media platforms. Third, the Act fails to prevent platforms from proactively monitoring, essentially surveilling, all content uploaded to their sites. Fourth, a lack of clarity in the definition of what is considered a regulated service could lead to platforms being required to break encryption tools that provide privacy and security online. Fifth, proposed requirements for platforms to retain certain kinds of data could lead to the unwarranted collection and retention of private information of social media users. And finally, seventh, there has been little consideration on how this law will inhibit the access of Canadians and people in Canada to content shared by people in other countries. Briefly, just on Part 2 of the Act, this section amends Canada's existing hate crime offences and creates a new standalone hate crime offence and is only tangentially related to Part 1. It has raised serious concerns among human rights and civil liberties advocates in regard to the breadth of the offences and the associated penalties. We've called for Parts 2 and 3 to be split from Part 1 in order to be considered separately, and we're very pleased to see that the government's announcement yesterday that they intend to do just that. I'd be happy to speak to any of these questions, any of these issues during questions, and I've submitted a more detailed brief to the committee with specific amendments on these issues. However, I'd like to try to focus in the time I have on the first 2 points that I've made regarding content that incites violent extremism or terrorism, as well as a definition of content that incites violence. The harm of content that incites violent extremism or terrorism is problematic for 3 reasons and should be removed from the Act. First, it is redundant and unnecessary. The definition of content that incites violent extremism or terrorism and content that incites violence are nearly identical. The major difference being that the first includes a motivating factor for the violence it is attempting to prevent. These 2 forms of harms are also treated the same throughout the Online Harms Act, including requirements for platforms to retain information related to these harms for a year to aid in possible investigations. Moreover, and maybe most importantly, incitement to violence alone would clearly capture any incitement to violence that arises from terrorist or extremist content. Further definition of what motivates the incitement to violence is unnecessary. Second, if included, incitement to terrorism will result in the unjustified censorship of user content. Terrorism and with it extremism are subjective terms based on interpretation of the motivations for a certain act. The same opinion expressed in one context may be viewed as support for terrorism and therefore violent, while in another may be viewed as legitimate and legally protected political speech. Acts of dissent become stigmatized and criminalized, not because of the act itself, but the alleged motivation behind the act. As we have seen, this leads to unacceptable incidents of racial, religious, and political profiling in pursuit of fighting terrorism. Studies have also extensively documented how social media platforms already over-moderate content that express dissenting views under the auspices of removing, quote, terrorist content. The result is that by including terrorism as a motivating factor for posts that incite violence, the Act will be biased against language that is not in fact urging violence, but is seen as doing so because of personal or societal views of what is considered terrorism or extremism. I note also that extremism is not defined in Canadian law. And that ties into the third key part that we're concerned about, and that's that parts of the language used in this definition are undefined in Canadian law or the criminal code. 30 seconds? Okay, I'll finish up here. And this contradicts that the government's main justification for all 7 harms, that they align with the criminal code and do not expand existing offences. There are several examples, but one I'll share is that the definition of incitement to terrorism, in fact, only includes actively encourages an act. There's no definition of what includes actively encourages. It's a much lower threshold than incitement, and in fact goes against what is already in the criminal code, which punishes either instructing or
Thank you
counseling
very
in terrorist
much.
activity.